A single sentence can shatter a world built on lies. For Maria Rodriguez, a 26-year-old waitress drowning in her mother's mounting medical bills, those 7 words were meant to be nothing more than polite conversation. For Alexander Blackwood, a man whose wealth could buy entire city blocks, they became the earthquake that would bring down a century-old empire of deception. The amber lights of Old Munich, an upscale restaurant on Berlin's Unter den Linden, cast warm shadows across white tablecloths at 11:15 on a Thursday evening in June 2023. Maria moved between tables with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp despite the exhausting double shift that had started 14 hours earlier. The restaurant was winding down, only a few late diners remaining in the elegant dining room where a single meal cost more than she earned in a week. Her section held just one occupied table now. A man sat alone in the corner booth, his presence seeming to command the very air around him. Alexander Blackwood wasn't just wealthy, he was sculpted from different material than ordinary mortals. His charcoal suit, so dark it appeared almost black, fitted him with surgical precision. Even under the restaurant's soft lighting, his Italian leather shoes gleamed like mirrors. He possessed that quiet, absolute confidence that whispered rather than shouted its authority. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything else this evening?" Maria approached with professional courtesy. Alexander didn't look up from his phone immediately. His eyes, a startling shade of steel gray, met hers for the briefest dismissive moment. "Just the check, please." As Maria reached across to clear his untouched dessert plate, her sleeve caught the light. There, on her right wrist, hung a delicate gold chain bracelet. Dangling from it was a small charm, an intricately carved phoenix with wings spread wide, a tiny sapphire gleaming like a captured star at its center. The detail was extraordinary, almost impossibly fine for such a small piece. Alexander's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. His gaze locked onto her wrist with laser intensity. The casual dismissal vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. Then shock. Then something deeper, something that resembled fear. "Sir. Are you all right?" Maria's voice carried genuine concern. But Alexander wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the phoenix charm, his face draining of color. Slowly, almost mechanically, he raised his own right hand. There, on his ring finger, sat an identical design, a gold signet ring featuring the exact same phoenix, wings spread, with an identical sapphire eye. The match was perfect, down to every carved feather detail. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Maria noticed his reaction and glanced down at her bracelet, then at his ring. A nervous laugh escaped her lips as she attempted to lighten whatever strange moment had overtaken him. "Oh, how funny. Sir, my grandmother has the same design as your ring." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alexander's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, clattering against the saucer. His breathing became shallow, rapid. The transformation was shocking. This pillar of corporate power suddenly looked fragile, vulnerable, almost broken. What did you say?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse with something that sounded like decades of buried pain. "The phoenix design. My grandmother Elena, she has a ring just like yours. She's had it my whole life. Says it's been in our family for generations." Alexander's hand shot out, not to grab her, but as if to ward off a ghost. His fingers trembled violently as he stared at her with wild, desperate eyes. "That's impossible. That design, there's only one ring like this in existence. It was custom-made for my great-grandfather, Count Maximilian Blackwood, in 1922. There has never been another." But even as he spoke the words, his certainty cracked. Because there it was, undeniably real, hanging from this waitress's wrist. The same phoenix. The same sapphire eye. The same impossible detail work that had taken a master craftsman months to complete. Maria's smile faded as she registered the intensity of his reaction. Something was terribly wrong here. Something that went far deeper than a simple coincidence of jewelry design. "Your grandmother, What's her full name? Where did she get that charm? The questions came rapid fire, desperate. Alexander's composure, the armor of wealth and power he wore like a second skin, was crumbling before her eyes. Elena Rodriguez. She's in St. Michael's Clinic now. The memory ward. But sir, why does this matter? It's just a family heirloom. Nothing special. Alexander's laugh was bitter, hollow. Nothing special. Miss Rodriguez, that family heirloom may be the key to the biggest lie ever told by one of Germany's most powerful families. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without another word, he pulled out his wallet, threw down several €100 bills, and strode toward the exit. At the door, he paused, his back to her. St. Michael's Clinic, you said? I'll be in touch, Miss Rodriguez. We have a great deal to discuss. The restaurant door closed behind him with a soft chime, leaving Maria standing alone among the empty tables, her heart pounding. In her reflection on the window, she could see the phoenix charm catching the light, suddenly feeling less like a cherished keepsake and more like a ticking bomb. What had she stumbled into? And why did a simple piece of jewelry cause one of the wealthiest men in Europe to look like he'd seen a ghost? The answers would prove more explosive than she could possibly imagine. Some words cut deeper than any blade, and the ones Alexander Blackwood spoke next would slice through Maria Rodriguez's world like a surgeon's scalpel. 3 days had passed since their encounter at Old Munich, 3 days of sleepless nights and growing dread that something far larger than she could comprehend was closing in around her. The call came at 7 in the morning while Maria was preparing for another grueling shift. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, terrifyingly efficient. Miss Rodriguez? This is Catherine Walsh, assistant to Mr. Alexander Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood requests a meeting this morning at 10 o'clock. A car will collect you at 9:30. Before Maria could protest or even ask questions, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a request, it was a summons. The black Mercedes that arrived precisely at 9:30 was more expensive than her family's apartment. The driver, a stone-faced man in a dark suit, said nothing during the 30-minute drive through Berlin's financial district. They pulled up to Blackwood Tower, a gleaming monument of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the morning sky like a blade. The executive elevator rose silently to the 42nd floor, opening directly into a reception area that screamed power and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, making Maria feel like she was floating above the world of ordinary mortals, a world she suddenly realized she no longer belonged to. Alexander Blackwood stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the vast windows. Even motionless, he radiated an energy that made the air itself seem charged. When he turned, Maria was struck by how different he looked from the shaken man in the restaurant. This was Alexander Blackwood, the titan, the corporate predator, the man who could destroy lives with a phone call. Miss Rodriguez. Please, sit down. His voice was controlled, deadly calm. On the glass table between them lay a thin manila folder. Maria remained standing. Mr. Blackwood, I don't understand why I'm here. If this is about the other night. It's about theft. The word fell like a hammer blow. It's about a lie your family has been living for over 50 years. Alexander opened the folder with deliberate precision. Inside were photographs, black and white images from what appeared to be the 1920s. The first showed a distinguished man with a carefully waxed mustache, wearing an ornate military uniform. On his finger gleamed the unmistakable phoenix ring. Count Maximilian Blackwood. My great-grandfather. This photograph was taken in 1922, the same year he commissioned the phoenix ring for master craftsman Henri Dubois in Paris. One ring. Unique. Irreplaceable. He placed another photograph on the table, a younger man, devastatingly handsome, with the same piercing gray eyes as Alexander. My grandfather, William Blackwood, inherited the ring in 1943. It has passed from father to son for over a century. An unbroken chain of ownership. Maria's mouth went dry. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but something deep in her gut rebelled against it. Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. My grandmother's ring is a fake. Alexander's interruption was surgical, precise. Or it's stolen. There are no other possibilities. He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a document, old, yellowed with age, bearing an official seal. This is the original commission order from Henri Dubois. 1 Phoenix signet ring. Solid gold, hand-carved, with a Ceylon sapphire eye. Delivered to Count Maximilian Blackwood on December 15, 1922. The room seemed to spin around Maria. Everything Alexander was showing her appeared authentic, documented, unshakable. But it contradicted everything she knew about her family, about her grandmother Elena, who had raised her with stories of the ring's mystical significance. My grandmother isn't a thief, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. She's the most honest person I know. She's never stolen anything in her life. Alexander leaned forward, his gray eyes boring into hers. Then explain how she came to possess an exact duplicate of a ring that exists nowhere else on earth. Maria felt tears threatening, but she fought them back. I don't know how to explain it. But I know my grandmother. I know my family. We're not criminals. Aren't you? Alexander's smile was cold as winter steel. 3 days ago, I had my investigators look into your family history. Would you like to know what they found? Without waiting for an answer, he placed another document on the table. It was a police report, dated 1971, featuring a photograph that made Maria's blood turn to ice. It was her grandmother Elena, but 50 years younger, being escorted from a jewelry store in handcuffs. Your grandmother was arrested for attempted theft from Goldstein Jewelers in Munich in 1971. The charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the report makes for fascinating reading. Alexander's voice dripped with manufactured sympathy. It seemed she was caught trying to pawn what she claimed was a family heirloom. When the jeweler became suspicious and called the police, she couldn't provide any documentation of ownership. The world tilted sideways. Maria gripped the edge of the table, fighting to stay upright. That can't be right. Grandmother Elena would never. The police report says otherwise. It also notes that she had a young daughter with her at the time. Your mother, Carmen Rodriguez, age 7. Alexander's eyes never left Maria's face, watching her world crumble with scientific interest. Tell me, Miss Rodriguez, what story did your grandmother tell you about how she acquired this ring? Maria's mind raced back through childhood memories. Elena had always been vague about the ring's origins, speaking only in poetic terms about family legacy and ancestral protection. Never specific dates. Never concrete details. Never names that could be verified. She said it was passed down through generations. That it protected our family. Protected you from what? The consequences of theft. Alexander stood, moving to the window. Miss Rodriguez, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand that you may have been raised believing in this fantasy. But facts are facts. That ring belongs to my family, and I want it back. He turned to face her, and Maria saw something new in his expression, not just anger or accusation, but something that looked almost like pity. I'm prepared to make this easy for you. Return the ring, and I'll ensure no criminal charges are filed. I'll even provide compensation for any inconvenience. 50,000 euros should be more than adequate to cover your family's medical expenses. The offer hung in the air like a poisoned gift. 50,000 euros would indeed solve their immediate financial crisis. It would pay for her mother Carmen's treatments, keep them in their apartment, give them breathing room for the first time in years. But it would also mean admitting that everything she believed about her family was a lie. I need to think about it, Maria said, her voice hollow. Alexander nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected. Of course. But don't take too long, Miss Rodriguez. My patience isn't infinite. And neither is my generosity. As Maria was escorted back to the elevator, one thought echoed through her mind like a death knell: what if Alexander Blackwood was telling the truth? What if her beloved grandmother really was a thief? The ride down 42 floors felt like falling through the circles of hell, each passing second dragging her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But in the lobby, as the elevator doors opened, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't just accept Alexander Blackwood's version of the truth. She was going to find out what really happened in 1971. And if her grandmother Elena was innocent, she was going to prove it, no matter what it cost her. The war for the truth was about to begin. Some secrets are buried so deep that unearthing them requires more than determination, it demands the courage to risk everything you thought you knew about the people you love most. Maria Rodriguez was about to learn that the hardest truths to face are often found not in dusty archives or police files, but in the silences between the stories we tell ourselves. The investigation began at dawn. Maria sat in the cramped kitchen of their modest Berlin apartment, surrounded by towers of documents she'd managed to acquire through a network of contacts she never knew she had. Old newspapers, faded police reports, courthouse records dating back 50 years, each page a potential key to unlocking the mystery that had consumed her life since that fateful night at Old Munich. Her laptop screen glowed with dozens of open browser tabs, genealogy websites, newspaper archives, public records databases. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight, fueled by cheap coffee and the desperate need to prove Alexander Blackwood wrong. Carmen Rodriguez wheeled herself into the kitchen, her oxygen tank trailing behind her like a mechanical shadow. The cancer had taken so much from her mother, her strength, her independence, her faith in tomorrow, but her eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had carried their family through decades of struggle. Carmen, I need you to tell me everything you remember about 1971. About the day Grandma Elena was arrested. Maria's voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but steady with resolve. Her mother's face went pale. Carmen closed her eyes, as if trying to lock away memories that had been festering for half a century. Maria, some doors should stay closed. Some truths are too heavy for the living to carry. But I have to know. Blackwood has evidence, police reports, photographs. He's painting Grandma as a criminal, and I can't let that stand. Not without a fight. Carmen wheeled closer, her frail hand reaching out to touch the phoenix charm that Maria wore constantly now, like a talisman against the forces trying to tear her world apart. I was 7 years old, Carmen whispered. I remember the jewelry store, the flashing lights of police cars, the way people stared at us like we were criminals. But Maria, what I remember most is how calm your grandmother was. She didn't fight them. She didn't protest. She just surrendered. Like she'd been expecting it all along. The words hung in the air like smoke, forming shapes that Maria couldn't quite grasp. There was something hidden in her mother's memories, something that didn't fit with either Blackwood's narrative or the family legend she'd grown up believing. Maria's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was elderly, German-accented, careful. Miss Rodriguez? My name is Hans Goldstein. I believe you've been asking questions about my father's jewelry store. We need to meet. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs. Hans Goldstein, the son of the jeweler who had accused her grandmother of theft 53 years ago. This could be the breakthrough she desperately needed, or it could be the final nail in her grandmother's coffin. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Munich's Old Quarter, 3 blocks from where Goldstein Jewelers had once stood. The train ride south gave Maria time to prepare her questions, to steel herself for whatever revelations awaited her. Hans Goldstein was a man in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the careful posture of someone who had spent decades bending over delicate work. He nursed a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, his weathered hands folded on the small cafe table. Your grandmother, she came to my father's store on a Tuesday morning in October 1971, he began without preamble. She had the ring with her, wrapped in a piece of black velvet. My father, he was suspicious immediately. Not because the ring wasn't authentic, it was clearly genuine, clearly valuable, but because of how nervous she was. Maria leaned forward, her breath catching. So the ring was real? Not a fake? Hans nodded slowly. Oh yes, very real. My father, he knew jewelry like a surgeon knows anatomy. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. French, he thought. Probably from the 1920s. But when he asked her about its provenance, she couldn't give a straight answer. That's when you called the police? Hans's expression grew troubled. That's where the story becomes complicated. My father didn't call the police, Miss Rodriguez. Someone else did. Someone who had been watching the store, waiting for her to arrive. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Someone had been waiting for Elena. This wasn't a random arrest, a case of a nervous woman arousing suspicion. This was a setup. Who? Maria's voice was barely a whisper. Who called the police? Hans pulled out a worn photograph, his father's store in 1971, taken by a local newspaper photographer documenting the arrest. In the background, barely visible through the shop window, was a figure Maria recognized from Alexander Blackwood's family photographs. A younger version of William Blackwood, Alexander's grandfather. Your grandmother didn't steal that ring, Miss Rodriguez. She was trying to return it. The revelation crashed over Maria like a tidal wave. Elena hadn't been trying to sell stolen goods, she'd been attempting to give back something that didn't belong to her. But someone had wanted her to look like a criminal. Someone had orchestrated the entire scenario to discredit her, to ensure that if she ever tried to tell the truth about the ring, no one would believe her. But why? Maria asked, though even as she spoke, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. What truth was she trying to tell? Hans leaned across the table, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The ring your grandmother carried wasn't just any piece of jewelry, Miss Rodriguez. According to my father's research, it was one of a pair. Twin phoenix rings, commissioned by Count Maximilian Blackwood in 1922. One for himself, one for his eldest son. Maria's world tilted on its axis. Alexander Blackwood had lied to her. There had never been just one ring. There had always been two. And if her grandmother had been trying to return one of them, it meant Elena Rodriguez had been telling the truth all along. The ring was a family heirloom, just not from the family Maria had thought. As Maria sat in that small Munich cafe, the weight of a 50-year-old conspiracy settling around her like a shroud, one question burned through her mind: who was Elena Rodriguez really? And what had the Blackwood family done to silence her? The hunt for truth had led her to more questions than answers. But now, for the first time, Maria knew she was hunting the right prey. The real story was about to begin. Sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one that transforms enemies into allies. As Maria Rodriguez discovered, when the foundations of a century-old lie begin to crumble, even the most powerful adversaries must choose between preserving their pride and confronting their past. The storm outside Blackwood Tower matched the tempest raging in Alexander's private office. For 3 days, he had been consumed by what Maria had told him in Munich, the revelation that his grandfather William had orchestrated Elena Rodriguez's arrest, that there had always been two rings, that everything he believed about his family's legacy was built on deception. Maria arrived at the 42nd floor soaked from the rain, her hair plastered to her skull, clutching a waterproof envelope containing photocopies of everything Hans Goldstein had shown her. She expected another confrontation, another attempt by Alexander to discredit her family. Instead, she found a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Miss Rodriguez. Alexander's voice was different, quieter, stripped of its usual commanding authority. Thank you for coming. The conference room had been transformed into something resembling a war room. Documents covered every surface, family photographs were scattered across the mahogany table, and a large screen displayed what appeared to be a family tree dating back to the 1800s. I owe you an apology, Alexander began, his words coming with visible difficulty. And an explanation. He gestured to a particular photograph, a formal portrait from 1920 showing two young men in military uniforms. They shared the same aristocratic features, the same piercing gray eyes, but their expressions were strikingly different. One looked stern, calculating. The other appeared thoughtful, almost melancholy. Maximilian and Dmitri Blackwood. My great-grandfather and his younger brother. Alexander's finger traced the faces in the photograph. The official family history mentions Dmitri only once, as a footnote about a black sheep who died young. But after what you told me, I had my researchers dig deeper. Maria leaned forward, studying the photographs. There was something familiar about Dmitri's face, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Dmitri was an artist, a sculptor, and jeweler. While Maximilian built the family's industrial empire, Dmitri created beauty. The phoenix rings weren't just random jewelry, they were his masterpiece, his vision of what the Blackwood legacy could become. He pulled out another document, this one handwritten in elegant script. This is Dmitri's original letter to Henri Dubois, the Parisian craftsman who made the rings. He writes about creating twin souls of gold and sapphire, one for the builder of empires, one for the guardian of dreams. Maria felt her breath catch. Guardian of dreams. That's what my grandmother always called herself when she talked about the ring. Because that's exactly what she was. Alexander's eyes met hers, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Maria saw not an adversary but an ally. Your grandfather, Igor Belov, was Dmitri's closest friend. They met during the war, bonded over their shared hatred of violence and their love of art. Alexander opened a leather portfolio containing letters written in multiple languages, German, Russian, and what appeared to be Czech. Dmitri and Igor corresponded for decades. These letters tell the real story of what happened to the Blackwood fortune, and why my family has spent a century trying to bury it. Maria's hands trembled as she read the translated excerpts. They painted a picture of two young men who had witnessed the horrors of war and dreamed of building something better, a business empire that would create rather than destroy, that would lift up the powerless rather than exploit them. Dmitri designed the rings as symbols of a pact, Alexander explained. Maximilian would handle the business side, but Dmitri would ensure that their wealth was used for humanitarian purposes. Half of all profits would go to rebuilding war-torn communities, supporting artists, funding medical research. What happened to the pact? Maria asked. Though she already suspected the answer. Alexander's expression darkened. Maximilian broke at the moment he had the chance. When Dmitri tried to hold him accountable, tried to force him to honor their agreement, Maximilian had him declared mentally unfit. Dmitri was committed to an asylum, where he died under mysterious circumstances in 1925. The room fell silent except for the rain drumming against the windows. Maria stared at the documents, understanding beginning to dawn. The ring, she whispered. Dmitri gave it to my grandfather before he was taken away. It wasn't just jewelry, it was evidence. Proof of the original pact. Alexander nodded grimly. And when Igor tried to use that evidence to expose the truth, my grandfather William made sure he was silenced. The arrest in 1971 wasn't random, Maria. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to discredit your family, to ensure that if they ever tried to tell this story, no one would believe them. Maria thought of her grandmother Elena, spending decades carrying the weight of this secret, never able to tell the truth without being branded a criminal. The injustice of it burned in her chest like acid. There's more, Alexander said quietly. He pulled out a final document, a will, written in Dmitri's hand just days before his commitment to the asylum. Dmitri left specific instructions. If anything happened to him, Igor Belov was to be the keeper of his ring, the guardian of his vision. And when Igor died, that responsibility would pass to his descendants. Alexander looked directly at Maria, his gray eyes filled with something that might have been reverence. You're not just wearing a piece of stolen jewelry, Miss Rodriguez. You're carrying the legitimate claim to half of everything the Blackwood family has built over the past century. The magnitude of the revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. She wasn't just the granddaughter of a woman wrongly accused, she was the heir to a fortune that rightfully belonged to her family. A fortune built on the dreams of an artist who had been silenced before he could see them realized. What do we do now? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city he had once thought belonged to him alone. We honor Dimitri's vision. We restore his name. And we make sure that his dream of a better world finally has the chance to come true. He turned back to Maria, and in his eyes she saw not the cold corporate predator who had threatened her just days before, but a man who had discovered that everything he thought he knew about himself was wrong, and who was determined to make it right. But first, Alexander said, his voice hardening with resolve, we need to deal with the people in my own family who have been working to keep this secret buried. And I suspect they won't give up without a fight. The storm outside was beginning to clear, but Maria knew that the real battle was just about to begin. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows where it had hidden for a century. Now they had to make sure it stayed in the light. When you threaten the foundation of a century-old empire, the empire fights back. What Maria Rodriguez and Alexander Blackwood discovered in the coming days was that some secrets have guardians willing to kill to keep them buried, and those guardians lived much closer to home than either of them had imagined. The first sign of danger came at 3 in the morning. Maria's phone shattered the silence of her small apartment with an urgent buzz. Alexander's voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled panic. Maria, you need to get out of your apartment. Now. Don't ask questions, don't pack anything. Just leave. Through her window, Maria could see a black sedan parked across the street, its engine running, exhaust visible in the cold Berlin air. She'd noticed it there when she came home from Blackwood Tower, but had assumed it was just another car. Now, watching it through her curtains, she realized how naive she'd been. How long have they been watching me? Since the moment you walked out of my building yesterday. My cousin Roman has resources I didn't know about, private security firms. Former intelligence operatives. Men who specialize in making problems disappear quietly. Maria's blood turned to ice. Roman Blackwood? I thought family was supposed to be on your side. Alexander's bitter laugh carried no humor. Family is often the most dangerous enemy of all. Roman has been managing the family's special interests for years, the kind of business that doesn't appear in annual reports. When our investigation started threatening his position, he decided to take direct action. Maria grabbed her jacket and the small bag containing copies of all their evidence. As she slipped out the building's rear exit, she could hear footsteps echoing in the stairwell above her, heavy, purposeful, getting closer. The rendezvous point was a 24-hour cafe in Kreuzberg, far from the gentrified neighborhoods where the Blackwood family held sway. Alexander was already there, hunched over a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single night. Roman called me an hour after you left my office yesterday, Alexander explained as Maria slid into the booth across from him. He wasn't subtle about it. Wanted to know what we'd discussed, what documents you'd seen. When I refused to tell him, he made it clear that your safety couldn't be guaranteed. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He threatened me directly. Worse. He told me the story of what really happened to your grandfather Igor in 1973. Alexander's hands trembled as he pulled out a manila folder. Igor didn't die of natural causes, Maria. He was murdered. The documents inside the folder made Maria's vision blur with rage and grief. Police reports that had been buried for 50 years. Autopsy findings that contradicted the official cause of death. Witness statements that had been suppressed or discredited. Igor Belov was found in his workshop, apparently the victim of an industrial accident, Alexander read from the police report. But the medical examiner's original notes tell a different story. Blunt force trauma inconsistent with machinery damage. Signs of a struggle. Evidence that the scene had been staged. Maria's hands shook as she read the names at the bottom of the report: investigators who had been paid to look the other way, officials who had been bribed to close the case quickly. And at the center of it all, the signature she was learning to recognize: William Blackwood, Alexander's grandfather. Why? Maria whispered. Igor had already been silenced. The arrest in 1971 discredited him. Why kill him 2 years later? Alexander pulled out another document, a letter written in Igor's careful handwriting. Because he never gave up. Even after the arrest, even after the humiliation, Igor kept trying to tell Dmitri's story. This letter was found hidden in his workshop, its addressed to a journalist in Munich, detailing everything about the original pact, the stolen fortune, the murdered brother. Maria read the letter through tears that blurred the words but couldn't diminish their power. Igor had been planning to go public with the truth, to expose the Blackwood conspiracy even if it meant destroying his own family's reputation. He was going to be the guardian of dreams that Dmitri had envisioned him to be. The letter was never sent, Alexander continued grimly. Igor was killed the night before he planned to mail it. And for 50 years, the truth died with him. Until now. Maria wiped her tears away, feeling something harder than grief crystallizing in her chest. It was determination, white-hot and uncompromising. Roman thinks he can silence us the same way his family silenced my grandfather. He's wrong. Alexander leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. Maria, you need to understand what we're up against. Roman doesn't just have money, he has connections in intelligence agencies, law enforcement, private military contractors. The kind of people who can make us disappear without a trace. Then we make sure we can't disappear. Maria pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. I'm sending copies of everything to journalists in 3 different countries. Insurance policies. If anything happens to us, the story gets told anyway. As if summoned by their conversation, Alexander's phone rang. The caller ID showed Roman Blackwood's name. Alexander hesitated, then answered on speaker. Roman's voice was smooth, cultured, carrying the same aristocratic accent as Alexander but with an undertone of cold menace. Cousin, I hear you've been having late-night meetings with unsuitable companions. Roman. Alexander's voice was steady, but Maria could see the tension in his shoulders. I wondered when you'd call. Oh, I'm not calling, Alexander. I'm visiting. Look outside. Through the cafe's front window, Maria could see another black sedan pulling up to the curb. 2 men in expensive suits got out, their movements precise and professional. They didn't look like corporate lawyers. You have something that belongs to the family, Roman continued. Both of you do. The girl has stolen property, and you have access to documents that could prove embarrassing. I'm prepared to make a fair exchange. What kind of exchange? Alexander asked, though Maria could tell he already knew the answer. The ring and all copies of your research in exchange for your lives. It's a generous offer, considering the inconvenience you've caused. Maria grabbed the phone before Alexander could respond. Roman Blackwood. This is Maria Rodriguez. I have a counteroffer for you. The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats before Roman's laughter filled the cafe, cold, genuinely amused. The little waitress wants to negotiate. How delightfully naive. Here's my offer, Maria continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. You have exactly 24 hours to turn yourself into the police for the murder of Igor Belov. If you don't, the story of your family's century of crimes goes public. Every newspaper, every television station, every social media platform in Europe. You're bluffing. Try me. Maria ended the call and immediately began typing on her phone again. Alexander, I need the names of every journalist contact you have. We're going to war. Outside, the men from the sedan were entering the cafe. Maria and Alexander slipped out the back exit as the bell above the front door chimed ominously. As they disappeared into the maze of Berlin's early morning streets, Maria clutched the phoenix charm at her wrist. She was no longer just the keeper of a family heirloom, she was the guardian of a truth that had been waiting 50 years for justice. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, the Blackwood family would discover that some secrets refused to stay buried forever. Truth has a way of surfacing at the most unexpected moments, and for Maria Rodriguez and Alexander Blackwood, that moment came not in a boardroom or courthouse, but in the depths of a forgotten archive beneath Berlin, where the final piece of a century-old puzzle would either save them or destroy them both. The safe house Alexander had arranged was a cramped apartment in Wedding, far from the gleaming towers of the financial district. For 2 days, they had been living like fugitives, surviving on takeaway food and nervous energy while their evidence spread across the internet like wildfire. The story was gaining traction. Journalists from Der Spiegel, The Guardian, and Le Monde had all picked up the thread, but Roman Blackwood's influence ran deep, and several major outlets had mysteriously killed their coverage. Maria stared at her laptop screen, watching the view counts climb on the video statement she'd posted to every social media platform she could find. Her grandmother Elena's story, told in her own voice from the memory ward at St. Michael's Clinic, was going viral across Europe. But viral wasn't enough. They needed smoking gun evidence, something so undeniable that even Roman's network of corrupt officials couldn't suppress it. That's when Alexander's phone rang with a call that would change everything. Alexander Blackwood? The voice was elderly, heavily accented, speaking in perfect German. My name is Friedrich Müller. I was Henri Dubois's apprentice in Paris in 1922. I understand you've been asking questions about the Phoenix rings. Alexander's hand trembled as he activated the speakerphone. Herr Müller, we thought everyone from that era was gone. The old man's chuckle was dry as parchment. At 98, I'm probably the last person alive who witnessed the creation of those rings. And after reading about your family's troubles in the newspapers, I believe it's time someone told the complete truth. What Friedrich Müller revealed over the next hour shattered every assumption they'd made about the case. The Phoenix rings weren't just symbols of a broken pact between brothers, they were keys. Literal keys, designed by Dmitri Blackwood to unlock a hidden vault beneath his workshop in Berlin, a workshop that had been converted into a government archive after the war. Dmitri was paranoid, brilliant, and prepared for betrayal, Müller explained. He commissioned not just the rings, but a secret chamber where he stored copies of every document, every contract, every piece of evidence that could expose his brother's crimes. The rings weren't just jewelry, they were designed to fit together, to create a unique key that would open the vault. Maria looked down at the Phoenix charm on her wrist, seeing it with new eyes. You're saying both rings are needed? Precisely. And according to my records, the vault contains not just evidence of the original pact, but proof of every crime the Blackwood family has committed for the past century. Dmitri was documenting everything, preparing for the day when justice would finally be served. Alexander was already pulling up maps on his laptop. The workshop, do you know where it was located? In Wallenstrasse 127, in what used to be the industrial district. It's been a government records facility since 1945, but the basement levels were never properly catalogued. If Dmitri's vault is still intact. They didn't need him to finish the sentence. If the vault existed, if it contained what Müller claimed, they would have enough evidence to not just clear Elena Rodriguez's name, but to bring down the entire Blackwood conspiracy. The journey to Invalidenstrasse took them through the heart of Berlin, past monuments to remembrance and reconciliation that seemed grimly appropriate for their mission. The records facility was a stern concrete building that looked more like a fortress than an archive, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. But Alexander Blackwood's name still carried weight, even in disgrace. A phone call to the facility director, a carefully crafted story about researching his family's wartime contributions, and they were granted access to the sub-basement levels that hadn't seen visitors in decades. The workshops had been converted into storage areas, filled with filing cabinets and bankers' boxes that held the bureaucratic detritus of 70 years. But in the northwest corner, behind a wall of obsolete computer equipment, they found what they were looking for, a steel door marked only with a small engraving of a phoenix. Maria and Alexander stood before the door, each holding their ring. The locks were concealed within the phoenix design itself, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. When they inserted both rings simultaneously and turned them in opposite directions, the mechanism clicked with the precision of Swiss clockwork. The vault beyond was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet, but it contained treasures beyond price. Filing cabinets filled with documents, photographs dating back to the 1920s, audio recordings on wax cylinders, and at the center of it all, a glass case containing a single leather-bound journal in Dmitry Blackwood's handwriting. The journal was his final testimony, written in the days before his commitment to the asylum. Page after page detailed Maximilian's crimes, the intimidation of business rivals, the murder of union organizers, the systematic theft of patents and innovations from smaller competitors. But more than that, it named names. Politicians who had been bought, judges who had been corrupted, police officials who had been paid to look the other way. "It's all here," Alexander whispered, his voice filled with awe and horror. "Every dirty secret, every crime, going back 100 years. Maria photographed each page with methodical precision, uploading them to secure cloud servers even as they read. But it was the final entry that made her hands shake with rage and vindication. "If something happens to me," Dmitry had written, "if Maximilian succeeds in silencing me, then I pray that someday, someone will find this record. The ring I have given to my friend Igor Belov is not just a token of friendship, it is the key to justice. He and his descendants are the guardians of truth, the keepers of the promise that good will ultimately triumph over evil. May they have the courage to use what I have preserved." As they emerged from the vault, their arms full of copied documents and their phones loaded with enough evidence to topple governments, Maria felt a profound sense of completion. Her grandmother Elena hadn't been a thief or a liar, she had been exactly what she'd always claimed to be, the guardian of a sacred trust. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. Waiting for them in the archive's main corridor were 6 men in dark suits, led by Roman Blackwood himself. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his voice remained cultured, controlled. "Cousin Alexander. Miss Rodriguez. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between Maria and Roman's men. "We have something that belongs to history, Roman. Something that's going to ensure your family's crimes finally see the light of day." Roman's smile was reptilian. "I don't think so. You see, this facility has had a tragic accident, a fire in the electrical system. Very unfortunate. Both of you were overcome by smoke before you could escape." But as Roman's men moved forward, the building's alarms began to blare. Emergency lights bathed the corridor in pulsing red, and through the windows, they could see police cars racing toward the building. "You see, Roman," Maria said, pulling out her phone to show him the live stream that had been broadcasting their entire expedition, "we learned from your family's mistakes. We made sure the whole world was watching." The look of absolute shock on Roman Blackwood's face as he realized his century-old empire was crumbling in real time was worth every moment of fear they'd endured. As police officers flooded the building and Roman Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, Maria felt her grandmother's phoenix charm warm against her skin. The guardian of dreams had finally awakened, and justice, delayed for 100 years, was about to be served. The reckoning had begun, justice, when it finally arrives after a century of waiting, doesn't whisper, it roars. And on a gray October morning in 2023, as Maria Rodriguez stood before the steps of Berlin's federal courthouse, the phoenix on her wrist caught the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, casting golden shadows that seemed to dance with the promise of redemption. 6 months had passed since the discovery in Dmitry's vault, 6 months that had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire continent's understanding of power, corruption, and the price of silence. The Blackwood conspiracy had unraveled with breathtaking speed once the evidence went public, a cascade of resignations, arrests, and revelations that reached into the highest levels of European government and business. Roman Blackwood's trial had concluded the day before. Convicted on 47 counts including murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and crimes against humanity, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But his conviction was just the tip of the iceberg. 3 judges, 12 government officials, and 26 corporate executives had been arrested in the aftermath. The web of corruption that the Blackwood family had spun over a century had finally been torn apart. Maria stood at the courthouse podium, facing a sea of reporters and cameras from around the world. In the front row sat her mother Carmen, no longer confined to a wheelchair thanks to the experimental treatment that the Rodriguez family could finally afford. Beside her sat Elena, Maria's grandmother, lucid for the first time in years, her eyes bright with pride and vindication. "Today marks the end of a 100-year lie," Maria began, her voice steady and clear. "But more than that, it marks the beginning of something my great-grandfather Igor Belov and his friend Dmitry Blackwood dreamed of, a world where truth matters more than power, where justice isn't for sale to the highest bidder." She looked down at the phoenix charm on her wrist, the symbol that had started this incredible journey. This small piece of jewelry was never about wealth or status. It was about keeping faith with a promise, the promise that good people would never stop fighting for what's right, no matter how long it took, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. From the courthouse steps, Maria could see Alexander standing at the edge of the crowd. He looked different now, younger somehow, despite the ordeal they'd been through. The crushing weight of his family's crimes had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something Maria had never seen in him before: hope. After the press conference, they walked together through Berlin streets toward the site that would become the Dmitry Blackwood Memorial Foundation. The building, once a Blackwood corporate office, was being transformed into a center for investigative journalists, whistleblowers, and advocates for social justice. Half of the recovered Blackwood fortune, nearly €2 billion, would fund the foundation's work in perpetuity. "Do you think he would approve?" Alexander asked as they stood before the construction site. "Dmitry, I mean. Do you think this is what he would have wanted?" Maria smiled, remembering the words from Dmitry's journal that had haunted her dreams for months. He wrote that the phoenix represents rebirth from destruction, hope rising from ashes. "Look around us, Alexander. That's exactly what's happening." The impact of their revelation had spread far beyond Germany. In 12 countries, investigations had been launched into business practices and government corruption. The Blackwood Files, as they'd become known, had sparked a global movement demanding transparency and accountability from those in power. University courses were being taught about their case study in corporate malfeasance. Documentary filmmakers were already working on productions about the century-long conspiracy. But for Maria, the most meaningful changes were the smallest ones. Elena Rodriguez had been formally exonerated of all charges from 1971, receiving an official apology from the German government. A scholarship fund had been established in Igor Belov's name for working-class students pursuing engineering degrees. And in the memory ward at St. Michael's Clinic, experimental treatments funded by the Rodriguez family's settlement were showing promising results for other patients suffering from memory disorders. 3 weeks later, Maria received a call that would complete the circle of justice. She was in the foundation's offices, working with a team of investigative journalists who had been given full access to the Blackwood archives, when her phone buzzed with an unknown international number. "Miss Rodriguez? This is Inspector Henri Moreau from Interpol. We've been working on a related case, and I believe you'll want to hear what we've discovered." What Moreau told her sent chills down her spine. Using evidence from the Blackwood files, Interpol had uncovered a network of similar family conspiracies across Europe, powerful dynasties that had used intimidation, murder, and corruption to protect their wealth and influence. The Blackwood case wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern that stretched across continents and centuries. "We're calling it Operation Phoenix," Moreau explained. "Thanks to your courage in exposing the Blackwood conspiracy, we now have the tools and evidence we need to investigate at least 30 similar cases. Your grandfather's ring wasn't just the key to one family's secrets, it was the key to exposing a system of corruption that's been operating in the shadows for generations." That evening, Maria stood on the balcony of her new apartment, a far cry from the cramped quarters in Wedding where she'd lived as a waitress. The city lights of Berlin sparkled below her, but her mind was on a small village in rural Russia where her great-grandfather Igor had been born, where a young man with dreams of building a better world had first befriended an exiled aristocrat with the same vision. Alexander joined her on the balcony, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had found his purpose. "The first Phoenix Foundation grants have been approved," he said, handing her a cup. 57 projects in 19 countries. Independent journalism initiatives, corruption watchdog organizations, legal aid societies for the poor. Maria accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring its warmth in the cool autumn air. Dmitri would be proud. Igor too. They planted seeds that took 100 years to grow, but look at the forest we're creating. Alexander pulled out his phone and showed her a news article from that morning. The headline read, "Phoenix Rising, How a Waitress and a Billionaire Changed the World." Below it was a photograph of them both, taken during one of their first press conferences, looking tired but determined. "We've become symbols," Alexander said with a mixture of pride and bemusement. Maria Rodriguez and Alexander Blackwood, the waitress who refused to be silenced and the heir who chose justice over inheritance. Maria laughed, remembering how surreal this all felt sometimes. "Do you ever miss it? The old life, the certainty of wealth and power?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. "When your only concerns are profit margins and market share, life is predictable. But I don't miss the emptiness. For 35 years, I thought I was building something important, but I was just perpetuating a lie. Now, for the first time in my life, I'm actually making a difference." As they stood together on that balcony, watching the city settle into evening, Maria felt a profound sense of completion. The Phoenix charm on her wrist had led her on an incredible journey, from a chance encounter in a restaurant to a global fight for justice that had changed both their lives and the lives of countless others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. "The documentary crew wants to interview Grandma Elena tomorrow. She says she's ready to tell the whole story on camera. All of it." Maria smiled, imagining her grandmother finally free to speak the truth she'd carried for so many decades. Elena Rodriguez, the woman who had been branded a criminal for trying to return a stolen heirloom, would have the last word in the story that had defined her life. "The Phoenix rises," Maria whispered to herself, the words feeling like a prayer, a promise, and a prophecy all at once. In the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their sound carrying across the city like a song of redemption. The truth had set them free, but more than that, it had given them the power to free others. And in a world still full of secrets and lies, that was the most precious gift of all. The guardian of dreams had awakened. The phoenix had risen from the ashes. And the revolution of truth had only just begun.